On the morning of July 14th, 1988, in Hardin County, Iowa, a man named Vernon Holt stood at the edge of his east cornfield and watched $400,000 worth of corn begin to die. It had not rained in 47 days. The soil, which should have been moist and dark with the smell of something alive, was cracked and pale, split into a mosaic of dry plates that lifted at the edges when the wind blew. The corn, 200 acres of it, planted in perfect rows with GPS-guided precision that hadn't existed 10 years earlier, was rolling its leaves tight. Rolling leaves meant a corn plant trying to survive. Rolling leaves meant the crop was in distress. Rolling leaves meant money evaporating in the July heat. Vernon had known this was coming. 3 weeks earlier, when the forecast first showed no rain through the end of the month, he'd switched on his center pivot irrigation system. The valley pivot had cost him $180,000 in 1986, financed over 12 years at 9.5% interest. At that price, you expected it to work when you needed it. For 4 days it had worked. Then the main gearbox had seized, a component the service technician said was manufactured in Germany, a component back-ordered 6 weeks minimum. The service company had sent men out 3 times. Nothing held. The pivot sat in the middle of Vernon's east field like a broken arm, while the sky stayed blue and cloudless and merciless, and the corn kept rolling its leaves tighter every afternoon. Vernon pulled off his cap, looked up at a sky that had no intention of helping him, and put his cap back on. He had $12,400 in loan payments due at the end of the month. He had another $9,200 due on his equipment line. He had 800 acres of corn that needed water and no way to deliver it. And 2 miles north, down the county gravel road that ran straight as a surveyor's line through the flat Iowa farmland, an old man named Clarence Voss was cultivating the greenest corn in Hardin County with a tractor that had been built before Vernon Holt was born. Let me tell you about Clarence Voss, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he built. Clarence was 67 years old in the summer of 1988. He had farmed the same 120 acres in Hardin County his entire adult life, taking over from his father August in 1962 when August's arthritis made it impossible to manage the fields alone. Before that, Clarence had worked alongside his father from the age of 9, learning every inch of that farm the way you learn things when you grow up with them. Not from textbooks, not from county extension pamphlets, from watching, from doing, from the kind of patient repetition that teaches you more than any classroom can. Clarence farmed with 2 tractors, a 1936 Farmall F20 that his father August had bought new for $825, and a 1949 Farmall M that Clarence himself had purchased, used in 1968 for $400 at an estate auction. The F20 was 52 years old in 1988. The M was 39. Between them, they had done every piece of field work on that farm for more than half a century. Clarence kept them both running because his father had taught him how, because the parts were cheap and available, and because a paid-for machine is worth 10 times a financed one, regardless of the year it was built. Clarence had no debt. He had never had debt, not a dollar, not a day, in his entire farming career. His father August had told him once, sitting on the porch after a long day of field work, That debt was the thing that turned a farm into a rental. When you owe money, you work for the bank, August had said. When you don't owe money, you work for yourself. Clarence had believed it because he had watched it be true. He had watched neighbors borrow and expand and then lose everything when prices turned or equipment failed or the weather refused to cooperate. The pattern repeated itself enough times in Hardin County that Clarence stopped being surprised by it. He just kept his head down and farmed his 120 acres and paid for everything in cash. But there was something else about Clarence Voss's farm, something nobody outside his family had known about for 60 years, something his father August had built with a shovel, a mule, and $180 worth of clay drainage tile in the spring of 1927. Let me tell you about August Voss and the water, because that is the real story here. August Voss had come to Iowa in 1919, fresh from a failed wheat farm in the Nebraska Sandhills, where 3 consecutive drought years had taken everything his family had. August was 28 years old when he arrived, and he had brought 2 things of value with him: the ability to work harder than most men could stand, and a specific, personal, bone-deep fear of dry weather. He had watched his father's Nebraska farm die of thirst. He knew what it looked like when corn hit drought stress in July, when the leaves rolled and the tassels burned and the ears filled poorly, and the yield that was supposed to pay the mortgage turned out to be barely enough to feed the animals. He had seen it. He did not intend to see it again. The farm August bought in Hardin County was good ground, rich black prairie loam that had been broken out of native grass 20 years earlier. But there was something on the back 40 acres that August recognized from his time in the Sand Hills, something most Iowa farmers overlooked because Iowa was supposed to be wet enough that you did not need to worry about it. There was a limestone spring on the north corner of the property where the land dipped slightly before rising to meet the fence line along the county road. The spring pushed water up through a crack in the limestone shelf. Not much. Maybe 15 gallons a minute in dry weather, more after rain, but steady, always steady. Even in August, when every other source of surface water in the county was low or gone, the spring kept flowing. August looked at that spring the way a thirsty man looks at water, which is to say, he looked at it and started planning. It took him 3 years of spare time to build the system. He started in the fall of 1924, after harvest, when the ground was soft enough to work, but before it froze. He dug by hand and by mule a network of shallow trenches across the North 40, each one sloped precisely 2 inches per 100 feet, precisely enough to move water by gravity without losing it to evaporation or pooling. He laid 6-inch clay drain tile in each trench, the same fired clay rings Iowa farmers used to drain wet ground, except August was using them in reverse, not to take water away from his fields, to deliver it. The spring fed a hand-built limestone holding pond, 20 feet by 40 feet, 6 feet deep, lined with puddled clay that August had mixed himself from the heavy subsoil. From the pond, the tile lines ran downhill across the North 40 in a gentle slope, branching into narrower distribution lines that ran between every 4 rows. August had calculated the slope carefully. He had drawn it out on graph paper in the kitchen in the evenings, checking his numbers twice before he touched a shovel. He needed the water to move far enough to reach the far end of the field without losing pressure. He needed it to flow slowly enough to soak in rather than run off. He got it right on the first try because he had been thinking about it for 3 years. The total cost was $180 in clay tile, 2 summers of weekend work, and the patience of a man who had learned patience the hard way. August never told anyone, not his neighbors, not the county agent, not the men he talked to at the co-op in Eldora. In 1927, irrigation was what California vegetable growers did. Iowa corn farmers did not irrigate because Iowa did not need it. The years between droughts were long enough that most farmers forgot the dry ones. August had not forgotten. He kept his system a quiet secret, the kind of insurance policy you do not talk about because if you talk about it, people think you are strange. He just kept the tile lines clean, kept the holding pond clear of silt, kept the spring fed and flowing. Every fall, after harvest, he walked every inch of the tile network with a steel probe, checking for collapses and root intrusions. He repaired what needed repairing. He passed the knowledge to Clarence the way he passed everything. By example, by doing it together, by making Clarence do it himself, while August watched and corrected. By 1962, when Clarence took over the operation, the tile system was 35 years old and functioning as well as the day it was built. The clay tile had settled into the soil, becoming part of the farm's natural drainage. The holding pond had developed a small population of frogs and water plants that filtered the water before it entered the distribution lines. The spring still pushed 15 gallons a minute up through the limestone, unchanged by drought or rain, indifferent to whatever the weather decided to do above it. Clarence maintained it for 26 more years before the summer of 1988. Every fall, the same walk, the same probe, the same repairs. He replaced cracked tile sections 3 times. He dredged the holding pond twice. Once, in 1971, a cottonwood tree's roots had collapsed a 6-foot section of the main distribution line. Clarence spent a long weekend digging it out, replacing the tile, backfilling by hand. When it was done, the system worked the same as before. By 1988, August's tile system was 61 years old. It had never needed a motor. It had never needed a pump. It had never needed a drop of electricity. It had never broken down in the middle of a drought. It had never required a repair part back-ordered from Germany. It just worked. The way things built carefully and maintained patiently tend to work. Year after year and decade after decade, long after the people who built them are gone. Now let me tell you about Vernon Holt, because you need to understand what he had before you can understand what he lost. Vernon was the kind of farmer that equipment dealers dream about. He had inherited 400 acres of good Hardin County ground from his father in 1971, and within 10 years had grown his operation to 800 acres, buying neighboring parcels as they became available, financing each purchase against the rising value of the land he already owned. By 1988, he had equipment worth roughly $600,000, all of it financed. 2 John Deere 4960 tractors at $85,000 each, a combine that cost more than most houses in Eldora, a grain drying system, 3 grain trucks, and the $180,000 center pivot. Vernon's banker had told him in 1986 that the pivot was a smart investment, that the ability to irrigate would protect his yields in dry years and put him ahead of non-irrigating neighbors. Vernon had believed it because he wanted to believe it, and because the math looked good on paper when prices were strong. He had not asked what would happen if the pivot broke down in the middle of a drought. Nobody had asked that question, so nobody had answered it. Vernon sat on every board and committee in the county. President of the Hardin County Farm Bureau, director of the Eldora Co-op. The John Deere dealer was his personal friend. Vernon got first look at new equipment, favorable financing terms, his name in the local paper when he installed the pivot. He was by every visible measure the most successful farmer in that part of Hardin County. He also got his say about other farmers' choices, and his say was almost always the same. Let me tell you about the conversation at the Eldora Co-op in April of 1988, because that is where Vernon Holt made the mistake that would define the next 2 years of his life. It was a raw Saturday morning in April, the kind of day when Iowa cannot decide between winter and spring. Half a dozen farmers were at the counter drinking bad coffee and talking about planting conditions and the spring corn price. Clarence Voss was there, having come in to pick up seed treatment for his planter. He was standing at the far end of the counter, quiet, waiting for the kid behind the register to find his order. Vernon came in loud the way he always did, told a story about the GPS guidance system being installed on his new 4960. The other farmers listened the way they always did with Vernon. Then Vernon noticed Clarence. "Something wrong with your planter?" he called down the counter. "I noticed you're in here instead of in the field. Came for seed treatment." Clarence did not look up. "What are you planting this year? Same as last year? Same as every year?" Vernon grinned and turned to the other men. "You know what Clarence is planting?" "Same hybrid his father planted, probably with the same planter his father used." He shook his head, smiling. "No offense, Clarence, but you're farming like it's 1962. The world's moved on." Clarence picked up his bag of seed treatment. "Does what I need it to do," he said. "What you need is a center pivot," Vernon said. "I'm telling you, this summer is going to be dry. Dry summer, the man with irrigation survives." He gestured around the room. "I've got $180,000 worth of insurance in my east field. What have you got? Those tile lines your grandfather put in?" He laughed. "Gravity-fed tile irrigation. You know what that produces. Stories for your grandchildren, not corn." The other farmers smiled. Clarence picked up his seed treatment, nodded at the kid behind the counter, and walked out without saying a word. Vernon watched him go. "Good luck in the drought," he said. Clarence drove home on the county road and started getting his planter ready. 3 months later, the drought came. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched the thing you were most confident about fall apart at the worst possible moment? Have you ever sat with a broken piece of expensive equipment and felt your certainty dissolve into something that felt a lot like panic? Because that is what the summer of 1988 was for Vernon Holt. The drought of 1988 was the worst to hit Iowa since the 1930s. By mid-July, portions of central Iowa were in exceptional drought, the most severe category on record. Corn that should have been tasseling was running weeks behind, short on moisture at exactly the moment it needed water most. Iowa's average corn yield that year would fall to 83 bushels per acre. In some counties, it was worse. The state lost a third of its expected crop in a single summer. Vernon had switched on the pivot June 28th. It ran 4 days. Then the gearbox failure, the parts back-ordered from Germany, the 3 failed temporary repairs, the broken arm sitting in the middle of 200 acres of dying corn. By July 14th, 47 days without rain, Vernon was watching his crop die at roughly $9,000 per day. He was still making $12,400 in monthly loan payments. He had crop insurance, but it paid on yield, and he had already locked in forward contracts at spring prices. If the crop failed, the insurance would not cover the position he was in. That was when he drove north on the county road and saw Clarence Voss's fields. If you want to know how this summer ended, what one old farmer's silence was worth, and what it cost a proud man to finally ask a question he should have asked 20 years earlier. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever watched a dry summer come and had something your grandfather left you that made all the difference. He had been driving to the elevator in Eldora, not thinking about anything except interest rates and broken gearboxes. He had passed the Voss farm 100 times. He drove by without looking for years. This time he looked. The corn was green, not struggling green, not hanging on green. Deep, healthy green, the kind of color a corn plant shows when it has had enough water and enough nitrogen, and nothing has gone wrong. The leaves were flat and open, catching the late afternoon sun, completely unrolled. In the field directly across the road, the corn was brown at the tips and rolling tight. One field dying, one field fine. No explanation that Vernon could see. No pivot, no portable irrigation rigs, no pump equipment anywhere. Just that ancient Farmall F-20 parked in the lane, and Clarence himself visible in the distance, moving slowly down a cultivation row at maybe 3 miles an hour. Vernon pulled over, sat there for 10 minutes. Then he drove to Eldora, got what he needed, drove back, and the whole way he was thinking about green corn and no pivot. That evening, he turned into Clarence's driveway. Clarence was on his porch. He had heard the truck come in. He sat there watching Vernon walk up without saying anything. "Your corn looks fine," Vernon said. "It is fine." "How?" Clarence looked at him for a long moment, the same patient look he had given him at the co-op in April. "Sit down, Vernon." Vernon sat on the porch step. He could not remember the last time he had sat on someone's porch and just talked. He was always moving too fast for that. "My grandfather built a gravity-fed tile irrigation system on this farm in 1927, Clarence said. Takes water from a limestone spring on the north corner and runs it through clay distribution tile across the north 70 acres. No pump, no motor, no electricity, just gravity." Vernon stared at him. "You irrigate with tile lines, gravity-fed. Have done for 61 years. That cannot work. You cannot deliver enough water through clay tile to keep a crop alive in a drought like this. My corn is alive." Vernon was quiet. He looked at the fields in the fading light. Then he looked at his hands. "How much did it cost?" he asked. "My grandfather spent $180 on tile in 1927. I have spent maybe another $600 on repairs over 26 years. $780, give or take." Vernon was silent for a long time. He was doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with numbers. He was comparing $180 against $180,000. He was comparing a working system against a gearbox in Germany. He was comparing debt against patience. "Can I see it?" he asked finally. "Come back in the morning." Vernon came back at sunrise. Let me tell you about that walk, because it was the most useful hour of Vernon Holt's farming life. Clarence walked him out to the holding pond first, showed him the spring, explained the flow rate, described how the limestone filtered the water naturally year after year. He walked Vernon to the first inspection box and showed him how you checked the flow during dry weather. He traced the main distribution line across the North 40, explaining the slope calculation his grandfather had drawn on graph paper 64 years earlier. 2 inches per 100 feet. Precise enough to move water, gentle enough to let it soak in. He showed Vernon the sections of tile he had replaced over the years, and how you diagnosed a blockage, and how you cleared one without machinery. He explained the annual maintenance walk, every fall after harvest, the same route his father had walked, the same probe, the same careful eye for the first sign of root intrusion or collapse. Vernon asked questions the whole time. For the first time in as long as either man could remember, he was asking instead of telling. "How did your grandfather know the slope calculation was right?" Vernon asked, standing at the far end of the North 40. "He figured it by hand, drew it out in the evenings for 3 winters before he touched a shovel." Clarence looked at the tile inspection box. He said if a farmer could learn to drain wet ground with clay tile, there was no reason he could not use the same principle in reverse to water dry ground. Where did he learn to do the math? He taught himself. From a book about land drainage. Vernon looked at the corn above him, green leaves, open and flat, drinking the pale morning light. Behind him, 2 miles south, his own fields were burning. "Why did you never tell anyone?" he asked. Clarence shrugged. Nobody asked. They walked back to the farmhouse in silence. At the porch steps, Vernon stopped. "I said some things at the co-op in April about your tile lines. I remember I was wrong." Clarence sat down in his chair. "Yes, you were." Vernon looked out at the fields. There was nowhere to put his eyes that didn't remind him of the difference between what he had built and what Clarence had inherited and maintained. "What do you think this drought is costing me?" he asked. Clarence was quiet for a moment. Bad year, wrong contracts, broken equipment. He paused. 300,000, maybe more. "That is close enough," Vernon said, "and I will still owe everything I borrowed before the drought started. The drought does not care about that. The bank does not care about that. I will have a year where I made nothing and still owe everything I owed before." Clarence said nothing. He had heard this story before. He had heard it from his father about neighbors in the 1930s. He had heard it during the farm crisis of the early 1980s, when half the county was underwater on loans taken out during the boom years. It was the same story every time. Different names, same ending. "How do you do it?" Vernon asked. "How do you farm without borrowing?" "Same way my father did," Clarence said. "Same way his father did before him. You live on what you make, and you do not take on what you cannot pay back." He looked at the fields, not at Vernon. "It means you go slower than the men who borrow. You do not expand as fast. You do not have the newest equipment." He paused. "But when the drought comes, or prices fall, or a gearbox breaks in Germany, you are still here the year after." Vernon nodded. He looked like a man doing difficult arithmetic, adding up the years of choices that had led him to a broken pivot and dying corn and a bank conversation he was not looking forward to. He got in his truck and drove back down the county road through the morning, past his own fields, toward a farmhouse where the numbers did not add up no matter how many times he ran them. Let me tell you what that summer cost Vernon Holt because the numbers are part of the lesson. His corn yield in 1988 came in at 44 bushels per acre. Across 800 acres, that was 35,200 bushels. He had contracted 25,000 at $2.10 per bushel in the spring. The remaining bushels he sold at the drought-elevated spot price of $3.15. Total revenue, $84,630. His operating costs, not counting loan payments, were $168,000. Seed, fertilizer, chemicals, fuel, hired labor, equipment maintenance, 3 service calls on the pivot that never fixed it. His loan payments for the year totaled $148,800. Total losses, more than $232,000. The bank restructured his loans in October, extended his terms, lowered his monthly payment, and took a formal lien on 200 acres as additional collateral. In practical terms, Vernon had given the bank a mortgage on 1/5 of his farm to cover a single bad year. The year he had spent $180,000 on irrigation insurance that broke down when he needed it. Clarence Voss's yield in 1988 on his irrigated North 70 was 121 bushels per acre. His South 50 came in at 60 bushels, better than county average because his soil health was strong from decades of careful management. Total revenue, just over $39,000. Operating cost, $10,800. He paid cash for everything. He went to bed in October with $28,000 in the bank. There is nothing in those numbers that requires explanation. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because this story does not end with one drought. Vernon did not recover quickly. Prices were soft in 1989, and his loan payments were still heavy. By 1991, he was farming 600 acres instead of 800, having sold the east field that the pivot had been designed to cover. The pivot itself went into a machine shed, repaired at last, but unused. Vernon had sold the land it was built to irrigate. He came back to Clarence's porch in the fall of 1990, this time without any pretense about what he wanted. "I want to understand what you do," Vernon said. "Not just the tile system, all of it. How you make it work on 120 acres without debt." Clarence handed him a cup of coffee. "Come back Saturday, and I will show you the books." Vernon came back Saturday. Clarence spread his farm records on the kitchen table. 3 decades of handwritten ledgers that his father, August, had started, and Clarence had continued. Every expense, every sale, every repair, every improvement. The numbers told a story that was simple and unglamorous and completely unlike anything Vernon had been doing. Clarence spent 22 cents of every dollar he made on operating costs. He spent nothing on interest. He reinvested 15 cents each year in specific improvements with specific returns he could calculate in advance. He kept the rest, building a savings account at the Eldora State Bank that had grown quietly for 30 years. In a good year, he cleared $30,000. In a bad year, $14,000. In a drought year like 1988, still $28,000. He had never had a year in the red. Vernon sat with the ledgers for a long time. "You made less than me in every good year since 1975, he said. "I know. How much do you have left?" Vernon did not answer. He did not need to. Clarence refilled his coffee. "The land was always going to be here," he said. "The question was always going to be, who would still be on it?" He paused. "My grandfather came to this county because he had already lost a farm in Nebraska to drought. He was not going to lose another, not to drought, not to interest rates, not to anybody. He built that tile system so the water would always be there. He lived carefully, so the farm would always be his. He taught me the same thing. Vernon looked out the kitchen window at the fields, brown now in late October, waiting for winter. "How do you get used to it?" he asked. "How do you watch neighbors expand and borrow and build and not want the same thing?" Clarence smiled, a small, private smile. "You watch what happens to them," he said. "You watch long enough, and it gets easier. Let me tell you about the last years of Clarence Voss, because the kind of man he was does not change at the end. Clarence farmed his 120 acres until 1992, when arthritis in his knees made it hard to climb on and off the tractors the way the job required. He handed the operation to his son Martin, who had grown up on that farm and knew every inch of the tile system the way August had known it and Clarence had known it. Martin took over the annual maintenance walk without being asked. He knew which inspection boxes needed watching after heavy rain. He knew the section of tile along the east edge of the North 40 that had always run a little slow. He knew the holding pond needed dredging every 15 years. Clarence Voss died in March of 1994 in the farmhouse where he had been born at the age of 73. The obituary in the Eldora newspaper mentioned his years of service to the Hardin County Grange and his membership in the Methodist Church. It did not mention the tile system. Nobody outside the Voss family knew it existed. Martin kept it running. The farm stayed debt-free. The spring kept flowing. Now let me tell you about 2012, because that is where this story closes the circle it opened. The summer of 2012 brought to Iowa a drought that the meteorologists described carefully and with some visible alarm as the worst since the Dust Bowl, worse in some measurements than 1988. Counties across central Iowa recorded no meaningful rainfall from June through most of August. The corn crop across the state failed at a scale that had not been seen in living memory. Land that normally yielded 170 bushels per acre was producing 60 or 70. Some fields were written off entirely. Martin Voss's North 70 stayed green. The tile system, 85 years old by that summer, performed exactly as August had designed it. The clay tiles were older than most of the people driving past on the county road, laid by hand by a man who had already seen what drought could do, who had spent 3 years thinking before he touched a shovel, who had built something that did not need electricity or parts or service calls because he had understood that the best systems are the ones that have nothing to fail. A young man came to Martin's farm in August of that year. He was 26 years old, newly married, farming 200 acres he had bought with savings and a modest bank loan. His grandfather had farmed in Hardin County decades earlier. His name was Kevin Holt, Vernon's grandson. He had heard the story from his grandfather, who was 87 by then, and still sharp enough to remember every detail. He had heard about the co-op in April of 1988, the laughter, the center pivot, the gearbox in Germany. He had heard about sitting on a porch step at sunrise asking questions he should have asked 20 years earlier. He had heard about the ledgers on the kitchen table and the numbers that told a story he had not wanted to hear. "My grandfather told me about this farm," Kevin said, standing at the edge of Martin's green north field while the fields in every other direction were turning brown. "He told me about the tile system. He said I should come and see it if I ever got the chance. Martin looked at the young man for a moment. Then he said, "Come on, I will walk you through it." They walked the North 40 the way August had walked it in 1927, the way Clarence had walked it with Martin, the way Martin had walked it alone for 18 years. Martin showed Kevin the spring, the holding pond, the tile network, the junction boxes, the slope calculation that August had drawn on graph paper 88 years earlier. Kevin listened the way his grandfather had wished he had listened, without interrupting, without comparing it to something more expensive, without already knowing the answer before the question was finished. When it was done, they stood at the edge of the field and looked at the green corn. "How much debt do you carry?" Martin asked. "80,000, Kevin said. "On the land." "Pay it down," Martin said. "Do not add more. When you can buy something with cash, buy it. When you cannot, wait." Kevin looked at the corn. His grandfather had said the same thing, had told him it had taken losing almost everything to understand it, had told him the most valuable thing he had seen in 50 years of farming was a tile line laid for $180 by a man who had already lost one farm and was not going to lose another. "I know," Kevin said. "I am going to try." Martin looked at him. "Good," he said. "That is all any of us can do. Let me tell you the last thing, because it is the thing that matters most. The tile system is still running. Martin Voss still does his annual maintenance walk every October, the same route his father walked, the same route his grandfather walked. The spring on the north corner still pushes 15 gallons a minute up through the limestone. The holding pond is still there, still clear, still ringed with frogs and cattails, and the quiet sound of water moving the way water moves when nobody has interfered with it. The clay tile that August laid in 1927 is 97 years old now. Some sections have been replaced over the decades, but the system itself, the design, the slope, the network August drew on graph paper in the evenings, has never changed because it never needed to. Vernon Holt's $180,000 center pivot was scrapped for parts in 2003. The iron went to a recycler in Ames. August Voss never put his name on what he built. There is no plaque, no county historical marker, no newspaper story. Just the spring and the pond and the clay tile running their 2-inch drop across the north 70 acres, delivering water to roots that have no idea what the drought is doing overhead. The dealers and the bankers and the equipment salesmen called what August built primitive. They called Clarence old-fashioned. They told Vernon Holt that $180,000 was the smart investment, and $180 was the foolish one. The drought of 1988 answered that. The drought of 2012 answered it again. Old knowledge does not become worthless because something newer exists. It becomes invisible. It sits in the ground under a quiet Iowa farm, doing its work, waiting for the next dry summer to remind the county what it forgot. That is the story of the water that cost $180 and the machine that cost $180,000 and the summer that showed everyone the difference. The story of a man from Nebraska who lost a farm to drought and spent 3 winters drawing on graph paper so it would never happen again. The story of a son who maintained what his father built, and a grandson who answered the door when a young man with debt came to learn what patience looked like. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the farmers who built things that lasted, who knew what debt cost before it cost them everything, who kept old equipment running and old knowledge alive because they understood that a paid-for farm is worth more than any empire on credit. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, was there someone in your family who built something that outlasted everything built to replace it? I would like to know about it. The spring does not care who is watching. It just keeps flowing.